I'm Namrita Bangia, Director, Global Mass Transit, and part of the organizing team. My team and I are very excited to welcome you all here. It's lovely to meet all of you. We hope to have yet another interactive session today, and I would urge you all to share your questions, comments, remarks, suggestions, feedback in the Q&A tab. To give everyone an idea, we have about 70 participants right now who've joined us, and we hope to have anywhere between 80 to 100 participants today. And as I mentioned, they joined us from Europe, Asia, Middle East, and North America today. So thank you very much for joining. I'd like to take a moment to especially welcome and thank our speakers for today. Endre from Ruter, Norway, Francine from UK Department for Transport, and Vincent from Wiener, Linien, Austria. Welcome and thank you. Today's panel discussion will be moderated by Richard, who is Partner and Global Head of Infrastructure at KPMG in the UK. I'd like to thank him as well, especially for accepting our request to moderate at a short notice. Before I hand over the controls to Richard, I would like to take a couple of minutes to introduce him and share with our attendees how they can ask questions today. Brief introduction of Richard. Richard has over 25 years of experience in infrastructure policy, governance, strategy, and financing, advising both public and private sector clients in the UK and overseas. He actually began his career at the UK Department for Transport and was later private secretary to the Secretary of State for Transport and the Deputy Prime Minister. He subsequently moved to the infrastructure advisory team at Citigroup and later joined KPMG in 2018. He has a particular interest in supporting the impending mobility revolution, promoting dialogue between the public and private sectors globally to maximize the benefits, both social and economic benefits of autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, and mobility as a service. Once again, thank you very much, Richard, for taking this on. A quick note to the attendees, the format of the webinar is straightforward. Each of the panelists will share their remarks and Richard will facilitate the discussion. After the discussion, I will put forward the questions on your behalf. Richard, you're also free to share your comments or ask follow-up questions as well. So jump right in when I'm asking questions on behalf of the audience. Also, there is a Q&A tab at the bottom. So you'll see a bottom strip, and there's a Q&A tab there. Please do post your questions there along with your name and company, and I will put them forward to the panel. There's also a tab of chat, so you can introduce yourselves there or chat amongst yourselves. Although I would suggest that you do it once the initial remarks are over. So questions in the Q&A tab and chat otherwise. Without much further ado, I'd like to invite Richard to take over. Over to you, Richard.
Namrita, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to Global Mass Transit for finding a way of continuing the discussion that we should have been having all together in a room, but having watched the first of these seminars with Sampo 2 weeks ago, I thought that was a cracking start, and really looking forward to both discussions today and the remainder of the series that you're going to run. Secondly, welcome to all of you who are joining us for the discussion this morning or this afternoon, as the case may be. Conscious that some of you still are going to be in isolation or trying to teach your teenagers trigonometry. Thank you for finding the time, despite everything else that's going on in your lives, to be part of this conversation. And then thank you to the panelists, who, if I now introduce one by one, and then we are going to run it, as Namrita has said, on the basis of each of our 3 expert panelists providing something between sort of 5 and 10 minutes of introduction, and then I'm going to bowl some questions at them to try to get the discussion going. And as Namrita has said, there's the opportunity for all of you who are watching to raise questions as well. So I'm looking forward to a really interesting discussion. This is our opportunity to hear from the perspective of public authorities, both transit authorities and governments, about how they see this impending mobility as a service revolution. As Namrita said, I'm personally really passionate about this. I think the combination of the electrification of transport, the rise of autonomous, not just vehicles, but also drones, and gluing it all together on the digital platforms that will be mobility as a service, is completely going to revolutionise our transport experience. But then, hey, I think we've just revolutionized our transport experience in the last 6 weeks. We're in the middle of some phenomenal experiment about what happens when people stop using their cars. And we're about to enter another experiment as we see what happens as we come out of this. So I'm quite interested to get into a discussion with our panelists as well about how they see the next 6 months and the next year panning out, and whether this is actually going to be good news for the rise of mobility as a service, or we're just going to have to work harder to make it happen. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to the first of our panelists to give his presentation. I'd like to introduce Endre Angelvik, who's a Vice President of Mobility Services at Ruter, which many of you will know is the public transport company that covers the city of Oslo. And you've got a fantastic background, Endre, because you also started out in the world of startups, where of course a lot of the mobility as a service revolution is currently being developed. So over to you to share your thoughts with us, please.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you also, Endre and Global Mass Transit, and for the opportunity to participate today. Please do enjoy the view behind me. I live close to the coastline, so this is actually from a sunny day a week or two back. So a couple of words of background and context. I work with Ruter. We are the public transit authority for the capital region of Norway. And in Norway, as you know, there's been a very strong sustainability and an environmental agenda that has been pushed really hard by the current political setting, where we're getting green parties into power and into position, and they're pushing very strongly for the sustainability agenda. And as such, actually some of the experiences and if there's going to be some kind of a silver lining to the current state of the world, we have seen the effect of taking out, especially car traffic, when New Delhi has a blue sky, which they haven't had for I don't know how many years. It really, really puts it out there. What is it that we're talking about when we're talking about driving a sustainability agenda and actually improving people's lives? The other effect that we now have less people sick from work and less health issues in the population in general, because nobody's talking to each other. Well, I'm not sure we're going to be able to sustain that in the long run, but that's another part of it. But from the sustainability agenda perspective, mobility as a service actually comes into play as a very important part, because it really has to do with creating a realistic alternative to owning a car. Something that you can rely on and trust, and actually is that makes your everyday life work, even if you don't have your car keys. And I very much agree with some of the perspectives that Sampo had on that in his session as well. And working with this now for at least the last 3-4 years, and also speaking at many different conferences, it's always interesting when I ask the audience, how would their everyday life be if they had to hand me their car keys and they didn't have the car? And people are just baffled. They don't really know how to respond, because life wouldn't work. You wouldn't get to work. You couldn't pick up your kids from kindergarten. You couldn't do afternoon things. You wouldn't be able to go shopping. A lot of things just falls apart if you simply remove the car from people's lives. And it really, really shows that you need to replace it with something. And the only thing that we have seen so far, at least in our view, and also matching up with the sustainability agenda, is the combination of all the pieces and components that MaaS provides, which is a more sustainable mix and a more sustainable solution to actually deliver the freedom and the everyday life that people want. And again, I very, very much agree with Sampo's perspective on that cars has a lot to do with freedom. And to us, this reflects back to our current vision in Ruter and for the mobility in the region, which is all about sustainable freedom of movement. And freedom is really the key part in that. And at the same time, we need to help people make it as sustainable as possible. And hopefully so that they can be part of creating a good life today for themselves and also a good life in the future for others. So that's sort of the background and where it's coming from. But that means that mobility as a service as an alternative to owning a car really is a key component in the ongoing political agenda and the sustainability agenda in our region. So what are we doing with it? Well, we have currently started, unfortunately, we started out in February. So we got started and then it sort of stopped. We had our shutdown on March 13th or 16th. And we have just started and we will carry on with it. But we have started a trial where we are actually inviting citizens in, about 150, 200 people, to see how can they live their lives without using a private car. For those that have worked with this for some time, you probably know about the experiments that was done in Gothenburg back in 2013-14. If I remember correctly, with EBGO and the trials there. And basically what we're trying to do is replicate those trials. And to us, this has a lot to do with actually showing our people in our geography, our inhabitants and citizens, that this can actually work for you guys. We have tried. It did work for these people. They're not that different from you and your needs. So this is sort of building understanding into the population, building examples, showing it, putting it out there, and making it real. Because when you talk about it on a more abstract level, yeah, people will nod and say, yeah, and they'll go out and drive their car. So bringing it out there is sort of the first step for us. And that's where we are at right now. Other players are also working in some of the same space, but I think currently what we're doing is the most complete and with the clearest target of providing a replacement for the car. It's still a trial, still small scale. If this flies well, it's going to roll on and do more. So that's sort of the state of it right now. I've probably used my minutes, so I'll leave it here for now and you can follow up. Back to you, Rich.
Endre, thank you very much indeed. And I was struck by your comment about the blue skies over Delhi, because indeed, about a couple of weeks into the lockdown in India, I was on the phone myself to a colleague in Delhi, and he said exactly the same thing. He said, you know, he was looking out of the window of his house and he could see the sky in Delhi, and it was a wonderful thing. You know, the challenge very much for the world is, as indeed I think the conversation in Europe has advanced faster than anywhere else. How do we create a new normal, a new reality, which is better than the one that we had when we went into this crisis, and how in particular do we use what we're learning to accelerate our drive towards net zero? And this conversation is clearly smack in the middle of that for all the reasons that you've just said. So we'll come back to some of those themes in a moment, but I want to hand over now to Francine Gilmore, who's MaaS policy advisor in the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles within the UK Department for Transport. Francine, welcome. I believe you've got some slides to share with us.
Yes, I do. I think Namata is going to share the slides. Thank you.
As if by magic, over to you.
Can we go to slide 1, please? That's the last slide. Can we go to the first slide, please? Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much. So as Richard said, I'm Francine. I'm part of the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles, also known as CCAV. CCAV is a joint unit in the UK government between Department for Business and Department for Transport. Today, I'm going to use my minutes to give an overview of mobility as a service from a UK perspective, and particularly focus on the regulatory review we're doing on mobility as a service at the moment, and to talk about our future transport zones. So MaaS is quite an exciting time in the UK at the moment. We've just launched a future of transport regulatory review, which includes looking at mobility as a service. So just to give you a bit of context here, definition of MaaS is quite contested, but in our Future of Transport Urban Strategy, published last March, we defined it as the integration of various modes of transport, along with information and payment functions, into a single mobility service. And two examples in the UK you might have heard of: the City Mapper Pass in London and WIM in the West Midlands. Next slide, please. So it's quite early for MaaS in the UK at the moment. It's currently in the early stages of development. There are a number of small-scale trials being undertaken by both public and private sector across the UK. And so we have decided that now is a good time to look at the regulations for this. So next slide, please. So as we know, with new technologies and new business models, now is a great time to start looking at things such as decarbonisation, automation, connectivity. All these buzzwords are coming into transport at the moment. And that has formed the basis of our regulatory review. Next slide, please. So back when we published the Future Transport Strategy, which I referred to a few moments ago, we published 9 principles that we want all new mobility modes and services and business models to adhere to. So I won't read these out, but key ones to note are walking and cycling and active travel must remain the best options. Public transport must remain a great option as well. New mobility services must be designed to operate as part of an integrated transport system, and data from new mobility services must be shared where appropriate. Next slide, please. So just to take you through the MaaS regulatory review, what we're doing, we opened it last month. The review is considering the regulatory changes that might be necessary to support the integration of different transport modes into a single mobility service, and the case for the UK government to do more to shape the development of these MaaS platforms. We want to develop a shared understanding of the opportunities and risks of existing, emerging, and prospective technologies and business models, the regulatory challenges that arise from these, and the possible solutions or mitigating actions that government could do to ensure new technologies and business models emerge in a way that aligns with the principles which I just outlined on the previous page. Next slide, please. So the key themes of the MaaS regulatory review, which we're looking at the moment, are digital infrastructure to support innovation. So as we all know here, MaaS business models are reliant on timetabling, routing, ticketing, and pricing data, which needs to be all interoperable. And digital ticketing is also required, so that can be booked on the same platform as a journey planner. We're also looking at a fair and open market for businesses to innovate. So the market for MaaS business models should be open, with barriers to new entrants recognised. We will consider what these barriers are and whether they require any regulatory intervention. We'll also look if there is a case for where monopolies might occur. We're also very interested in accessible, inclusive, and safe mobility. So MaaS business models should promote accessibility, including making it easier for the disabled user. They should be inclusive to all sectors of society. So we need to think about those who have poor rural connectivity in terms of their internet, don't have a bank account, and so on, or don't even have a smartphone. And we also need to know that consumers should be protected should there be any disruption to the journey. So this comes back to the liability issue of who's responsible. Is it the MaaS provider or is it the transport provider? And all journeys should be made safe and secure, and this is in line again with our future transport principles. And then finally, we're also looking at the impacts on the wider transport system. So new business models will influence how consumers travel. And this will shape the wider transport system in terms of the uptake of public transport and active modes. And it will also impact on congestion and emissions. So we need to look at the competition between modes as well as part of this regulatory review. Next slide, please. So just very quickly, I'm just going to shamelessly plug our call for evidence consultation that we've got going on in the UK at the moment. So our closing date is now Friday the 3rd of July, so that's hot off the press. As of yesterday afternoon, we've got it extended from the 22nd of May, as we realise many of our stakeholders are struggling in the current circumstances to get their consultation in on time. So I think Marta is going to share around these slides after, but there's a link to the online survey there as well. Next slide, please. So just in the remaining 2 minutes or so, I'm just going to talk you through future transport zones. Next slide, please. So what's a future transport zone? Well, these were announced in conjunction with our call for evidence consultation on mobility as a service, where we're also looking into flexible bus services and micromobility as part of that if you're interested. But we also announced these future transport zones winners. So this is our flagship, it says 90 million, should be 92 million, program for testing new technology and business models at scale in the UK to help us understand risks and benefits. So we've invested all this money to support local leaders and industry to trial new approaches. We have 3 winners, so Derby and Nottingham, Portsmouth and Southampton, West of England, and Transport for they all joined Transport for the West Midlands, which was announced as our early Pathfinder winner. Now, as you can see from the slide, all of these winners, all of these locations have all proposed trialling online MaaS platforms. So this program is going to take place over a number of years, and we'll be looking and monitoring what's going on there and learning from its impact and how these could be upscaled across the UK. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for your time.
Francine, thank you so much. I picked up particularly when you talked about the desire to create an open market as one of those principles, and just a bit of early warning. I think I'd like to get into that discussion after we've heard from Vincent. There's something about, I think, in public perception, the idea that because you're creating a single platform for, let's say, a city, that therefore it's almost inevitable that this isn't going to be an open market. But equally, I know from conversations, including ones I've had with Ruter in the past, that there are many models out there that try to create a distinction between that which needs to be managed centrally and that which can be effectively opened up to the market generally. And I'd like to get into that discussion, and in particular, where we see the role of data and data sharing and the role of authorities in terms of getting that data sharing. So we'll come back to that later. But I'd now like to bring in the third of our panelists, Vincent Neumayer. Vincent, welcome to you. Vincent is project manager for multimodal mobility at the Wiener Linien in Austria, which is, as again many of you will know, the public transport authority for Vienna. So Vincent, over to you to share your thoughts with us, please.
Richard. Hello and welcome to everybody from my side. As introduced, my name is Vincent Neumayer. I'm project manager for a quite small and quite new department at my company at Wiener Linien, responsible for multimodal mobility. And with respect to that as well, responsible for the overall strategic discussion about mobility as a service and what that actually means for us as Wiener Linien, but as well for the city of Vienna. Just to give you a quick glance into Wiener Linien, we are mainly transport operator. We call ourselves integrated transport provider. That means we own the buses, we own the complete fleet, we own the infrastructure, that means tracks. We own the staff, so the drivers are all ours, but we take responsibility as well for duties which are usually part of the transport authority. We plan network extensions together with the strategic planning department, strategic mobility planning department of the city of Vienna. We are doing all the timetables and so on. So we have maybe some kind of like a special role within the city administration of Vienna, and we are currently responsible for 38% of the trips made in Vienna. And when we take a closer look, for example, to working induced trips, then we're responsible for about 50%. As you know from all the model split analyses, for example, leisure time trips are more prone to be done by private vehicles, but for this daily life, for these commuters within the city limits, the Wiener Linien are quite in charge of getting people from A to B. Not at this particular times of the year and of the decade. We had, of course, a very, very severe drop down to 10% of our normal transport capacity during our lockdown. And of course, right now, because we are slowly mitigating our measures, we ask the questions: how do we get the people from A to B without getting infected, basically? But yeah, those are currently the daily life questions which we tackle. But coming back to MaaS, I would like to just give you a few thoughts from my side, because it's not that we have one vision about MaaS which we pursue, and this will be reached, for example, in 5 to 10 years. But already within Austria and within Vienna, mobility as a service as a concept is still quite in debate. There are a lot of activities going on. We have a working group on the ministry level talking about mobility as a service made in Austria. What does it mean? What kind of quality standards can we establish? We have two big lighthouse research projects going on called Domino and Ultimop, where a lot of different stakeholders and mobility services, and as well the platform designers, IT providers, and so on, come together discussing and testing what mobility as a service could look like for Austria. And then we have our particular governance system in Austria. We are, for example, public transport provider and operator. We have transport associations, 8 transport associations all over Austria. We are a federal state, so we have with counties, provinces, all having their say in the discussions. And we need to bring this all together to create at least one national perception of mobility as a service. And here we're not discussing about the European perspective, where currently, of course, some regulations have an impact on mobility as a service, but there is no single pathway which we all want to walk. And with respect to that, it's very exciting to hear as well the examples from Norway and from UK, who of course try to understand how MaaS can really have an impact on the mobility behavior of people, because that's our actual goal, to reduce trips done by private cars. It's that simple, actually. That's why we actually drive mobility as a service. And unfortunately, Richard, and I'm working on this subject for now 3 to 4 years, and I think it's more an evolution and unfortunately not so much a revolution, which a lot of times when I listen to Sampo, I'm so fascinated by his motivation and enthusiasm, but I think there are so many tasks to do, so many barriers to overcome until we really get the revolution going on. Because mobility as a service asks some questions, for example, about who actually keeps the lead over infrastructure in future times. Of course, when you ask me, it's quite clear. We say, okay, the public sector should be responsible for the key infrastructure, and that means not only tracks, but that means as well the digital platform necessary to integrate and actually combine dozens and myriads of mobility services. Mobility as a service, even more than in the past, asks for a coordinated strategy between private sector and public sector, and it asks the questions about the core responsibilities of the public sector. Because, for example, us as Wiener Linien and public administration in the city of Vienna, we are not very well in making businesses thrive by limiting them at the same time, because we want to achieve and we want results in reducing the ecological impact by transport. And so those are the questions which actually keep us busy. We have a lot of fields where we need to get active as Wiener Linien. but as well as a city administration. And then I'm coming already to a close down of my remarks, when we focus first on the customers and the consumers, and secondly, of course, on the whole mobility system. And it's, of course, it's not only about digitalization, and it's not only about integrating into one digitally accessible platform, but it's as well about giving access to public space, which in my opinion and in my case for sure is a very hot topic in Vienna, because it's not clear, and there are no clear guidelines to private mobility operators who want to just enter a market. On a digital level, it's you need to have this API, and then we can connect you. But what do they need to pay for accessing and using actually the curb and the public space compared to private vehicles, where of course there is a regime for decades since the Second World War. Yeah, this is just one question among a lot of questions. It means as well that the public sector needs to tackle new forms of more dynamic management tools. It's about data management, Richard, as you said. It's about opening public data to private providers, private operators, but as well receiving data from them in order to react quickly on demand and supply, but as well in order to close gaps in the mobility offers by the public, but as well, hopefully in future times, you can close those gaps by private mobility operators. And finally, I think it will grow and grow, but if it comes down to numbers, private mobility services are responsible for not even 1% of trips in Vienna. So here you need to create a business environment which makes it possible for them to survive under good working conditions. And I don't want to start a discussion about Uber and so on, but those are actually the questions. How can you make it possible for e-scooters providers and operators to contribute to the mobility system, to have a share of the market, but to offer as well good working conditions and socially sustainable working conditions for their employees. Yeah, and all those questions and many more are of course going on and are making us think a lot. Yeah, and I'm welcome to discuss those questions with all of you.
Vincent, thank you so much, and thank you for posing, I think, some of the really fundamental questions that authorities are grappling with all over the world. I was struck when you said there were no clear guidelines for private organisations seeking to enter this market. I was reminded of an article that we as KPMG put out a year ago as part of our emerging trends report. Every year we put out a sort of 10 emerging trends in the infrastructure and transport sector globally, and the first one on that list a year ago was titled "The Public Sector Asserts Its Role," and it was really a reflection on what we'd seen over the previous couple of years, where companies like Uber and the bike companies and the scooter companies had sort of seen what they thought was a consumer market, where they could literally just put scooters and things on the streets of a city like Vienna. And there was this period when public authorities were really unsure how to react to that. And then we sort of saw what we called the reassertion of role, where authorities started to say, hang on a minute, we're the city authority and we're responsible for what happens on our streets, and we need to set those guidelines. But you're right, I'm not sure many authorities yet have set any clear guidelines. And it really does bring us into this question of, so what is the role in the long run of the authority in charge of a city? Endre and Francine, you talked about the role today of authorities in terms of encouraging trials and so on in order to encourage this. I'm still going to call it a revolution, if you don't mind, Vincent. But beyond that, in the long run, what is the role of the authority? If I can come to you, Endre, Vincent posed this sort of question about surely the public sector itself needs to provide that platform for mobility as a service. Do you agree with that?
That question has a tendency to be there and come and go. And I think the discussion about one platform right now, there's so many parts to that, because technically there is one discussion. Can you technically flow data somewhere and so do something? Fine. That's one part of it. The business side is a totally different one. And that has to do with what happens if somebody doesn't deliver. Where are the guarantees to the customer? What is going to be the money flow and all of that? And that is a lot more difficult to sort of standardize into one thing where you can have one agreement. So I think it's an easy question to pose, but I think it's sort of driven by the phase we're in. We're still very early, and I think a lot of the MaaS thinking comes from sort of a digital technology mindset. And I have a background from an education in that field. So, and I think one of the challenging things is that the digital thinking, where data integration is easy and where digital capacity is unlimited, you can always buy another server, it sits in a data center somewhere, is fundamentally different from, say, physical space, which Vincent brought up, but which I also think is an excellent point. There is only that many square meters on the globe. And I think going back to what is going to be the role of the public sector, I think one of the key roles is actually to managing our common good. If we're going to work together as societies where we live close together, that needs to be managed. And especially demonstrated in times like these, it's actually a health risk. If we don't do it correctly, people die. That's where it's at. So space needs to be managed. There is a role for, I think, for public entities. Is that going to be on a digital platform or a business platform level, or where is that going to play out? I think that is going to have also a local flavor, because this is going to have, it starts out with the local physical space, with the cities, with where you want to do stuff. And the conditions are going to be different from city to city. Delhi is a different city than New York, than Oslo, than Rio de Janeiro. And those local conditions need to play a part, and that can actually end up driving the motivation for why you want to do stuff. In Norway, I had heard a really excellent talk from a former mayor from South America. In Norway, we try to get people out of their cars. And she said, how the hell am I going to do that when social mobility is getting to having a car? Yes. When getting away from the bike and to the car is the sort of social upwards mobility in society.
Yeah, which is why I liked your focus on taking that word freedom, which is so often associated with car ownership, and saying our challenge is to create sustainable freedom that doesn't require people owning those cars. Yep. But personally, I'm not necessarily sure it means that we want to get rid of the car. As long as the car is zero carbon, the electricity is powered from renewable sources, it's a device that doesn't kill the 1.3 million people a year that car today does, and it's shared and managed in a way that takes the congestion off our streets, then to me it should be part of the mix. But can I
completely agree with you on that? And just to, I think you have one really, really important key point in what you just said, and that's shared. If we don't get sharing to work, capacity and infrastructure and all of that is going to drive us into just delaying problems to come a little later if we can get rid of the sort of the direct emissions, stuff like that.
Yeah. Can I come to Francine? And I still want to just hold with this data point if I can for a moment, but feel free to come in on anything else that Endre and Vincent have said. I remember about 2 to 3 years ago, the UK National Infrastructure Commission produced a really, really controversial report called Data for the Public Good, which essentially argued that data that was related to the provision of public services needed to be shared and transparent and essentially publicly owned, i.e., not necessarily literally owned by the public sector, but held the responsibility for it and the access to it held by the public sector, in order to be able to drive that common good that, Endre, you were talking about a moment ago. Francine, how does CCAV see the role of data, and in particular, what role does it see for the central government in terms of determining how to create that shared transparency in data that will allow mobility as a service platforms to thrive?
So firstly, I'm going to say I'm not a data expert, but I can give you the overviews of DFT's kind of thoughts on data. So in terms of MaaS, we've already taken a number of initiatives to open up and digitalize relevant data across the modes. So we have things in place such as Bus Services Act 2017, Rail Sector Deal, Local Data Action Plan, and I won't bore you with a long list, but as you can see, we've got things going across different modes. Alongside making data more accessible, the British Standards Institute is carrying out a scoping study to map the existing data landscape and explore whether current standards are fit for purpose in the future of transport context. And so as new modes are developed, including micromobility, we'll consider any data requirements to incorporate them into a MaaS platform. So I think we don't really have the answer yet. It's definitely something that we're exploring in the call for evidence that I've mentioned today. And the call for evidence is very much a call for evidence. For MaaS, like I said earlier, we're still very much in the early stages of grappling with this new concept. For the UK, I'd say it's relatively new. And as my fellow panelists have said, we're still a bit of a dilemma of harnessing it for the greater good. And that's where we are with data.
Thank you. I want to pick up with Vincent another point that Endre made. So Vincent, you introduced this issue of the responsibility for space, and like Endre, I agree. This is a great topic because it's all about the optimization of capacity, isn't it? It's not just that there's only so much space on the planet; it's that there's only so much space for things on wheels in our cities. And one of the big arguments for the continued use of mass transit is because it's the only efficient way of moving a significant number of people within a capacity constrained environment. But where you don't have that constraint, so let's say it's the interurban space between our cities, then that doesn't necessarily apply. So Vince, I'm just interested in your thoughts on this, because you said something around we need to try and create a consistent position across the whole of Austria. And I guess you could then extrapolate that and say, well, there should be some sort of EU-wide consistency. But is that necessarily true? Or is Endre right that it's a very local decision and you could end up with a different solution in different places?
It is indeed a very local question, because when we take a closer look on our urban development areas, which are partly under reconstruction or partly really planned from scratch, so on just green fields, those questions are of course not as severely discussed. But the business takes place where people are, and people are usually, and this probably is the case in all those from the urban structural point of view, medievally shaped cities and towns in at least Central Europe, Western Europe, so that where people are densely located, where businesses are, space is scarce, and space is currently distributed quite strongly to private cars and to private cars moving or parking. And here, of course, it's a question, why should they have the biggest share? But when you take a closer look on urban development areas, those questions are not the most discussed ones. Those we talk about who is paying some incentives in order to get business running for car sharing providers, for example, or for test trials, as Endre mentioned. What we are on a very small scale, try and test here in Vienna and around Vienna. And then, of course, such questions are not posed in, for example, on the countryside, where some, for example, association-based and organized car sharing schemes work out quite well without any kind of integration, because what should you integrate it with? Because outside there is public transport, maybe, usually, of course, on the countryside, very weakly developed public transport. And then there is one car share, so you don't need a big integration. So yeah, I agree. It's very locally organized, but I think that the overall challenges, they apply to India at the same time, like Norway, where you have dense areas and then sparsely populated areas. And I think you can find here some really some common solutions.
Thank you very much. Namata, I'm conscious that we are heading into the sort of last 15 minutes, and I'm keen for the opportunity for any of those in the audience to have a chance to put some questions. Have we got any questions that you'd like to highlight now?
Yes, we have quite a few questions here, and unfortunately they've not shared who the question they're asking the question to, but who the question is posed to, but maybe one of the panelists can decide to answer. So Matthias from Swiss Federal Railway is asking if we know of any MaaS initiative that has shown a sort of a significant change in the modal split, and if no, why is the situation such despite all the work that has happened on MaaS? And he's saying that especially if there is a change in the modal shift towards shared vehicles. So if there's any sort of initiative that we know of.
Could I comment on that?
Yes, please go ahead.
Referring back to the experiment that was actually done in Gothenburg back in, again, around 2013. They did actually demonstrate a fairly clear modal shift in favor of public transit, walking and biking among the participants in that trial. And that was a 6-month trial. It had about 70 households, and there was a very clear shift in a positive direction towards public transit, biking and walking, having quite a significantly larger share of the journeys. And this is also consistent with what's found if you look at car sharing, where people move from owning a car to using car sharing solutions. There is a similar tendency, and this has also been demonstrated in research or found in research. Scales of that I'm not familiar with, but my view on this would definitely be that there has been demonstrations of positive effects as far as desired modal share direction.
Okay, Vincent or Francine, would you like to comment as well?
Okay, I'll have to comment on this. So the sharing economy in the UK has seen rapid growth in recent years. Here's just a statistic for an example. The number of car clubs across the UK has increased almost 8-fold between 2007 and 2017 to nearly 250,000 members. So we can see that shared mobility is definitely on the rise in the UK.
Okay, Vincent, you wanted to share something as well.
Just yeah, to add to Endre, I'm aware of a lot of trials, and among, of course, the persons or being addressed in those trials, there are some severe shifts, really empirically stated. But I don't know, and I looked into this as well already. I don't know any kind of cities, like on the whole city or town level, where you could really have a huge impact. So best example are all those integrating platforms. The users of the platforms, they change their behavior, but usually the platform doesn't have a huge impact, or sometimes even not even a measure impact which you can measure on the whole population groups or on district level. So on that we still need to work.
Okay. Ginny from Mobility X is sharing that there were several assumptions that were taken while the discussion was going on. So many assumptions that I think each of the cities or the country took. So he would like to know, so one of the assumptions was that people want to share. So they want to use shared mobility. So he wants to know how many percentage in each of your cities, or Francine, you can pick a few cities from your country, or one or two you can talk about. The second point that he mentions is that the second assumption was people want to choose green mobility. So how many percentage in your city?
So just while our panelists are cogitating on that, I'm conscious that one of the things that we have one of the things that we've conflated in this discussion is the sharing of particularly vehicles from the shift from the private vehicle to the rented vehicle, so mobility on a demand. And the two are really very, very different things. And certainly from my point of view, you can see that it's easier, and the evidence from cities all around the world where companies like Uber have been active is that particularly for younger generations, it doesn't take very much for them to be happy with the idea of mobility on demand. But that's not the same necessarily as them sharing that vehicle with anyone else. And I know from discussions that I had last year in Lisbon, that they are particularly worried about a world in which actually you get more vehicles on the street rather than less, in the same way as New York has got clogged up with Ubers waiting for rides, because you've actually made it easier for people to access vehicles in an urban setting through this revolution. So I think it's a really good question whether how do you incentivize people to not simply embrace mobility on demand, but also share. That's a much harder step in my view.
If I could comment on that as well, I absolutely agree with you, Richard. And looking forwards, it is most definitely hard. And in Norway so far, car sharing has not picked up at all. Not comparable to other European countries where it's actually gotten a foothold, and at least for some segments or some types of journeys, we've not really gotten anywhere. And we might simply have too much money and too much space and people too much liking their cars. So from my perspective, trying to drive mobility as a service and trying to drive sharing, that is a really, really big challenge. And it might be in people's heads, or it might be a freedom feeling, it might be a lot of different things. That's also why we were trying to try things out and work with consumers on this. Because looking at election results and also opinion polls, there is a strong drive in Norway and in our region that people want more sustainability. That is there. But still, would they choose sustainability instead of freedom? Well, that's where you pose a difficult question, hence the sustainable freedom of movement. We need to make sure that people can live their lives and do whatever they do on an everyday basis, and not see this as a shrinking their freedom, but helping them maintain the freedom in a sustainable way. Do I have all the answers to how to do it? What are going to be all the pieces? Not yet. That's why we're working on it. And I think this is also why some of the stuff around mobility as a service, and especially sharing vehicles and those parts, they are difficult, and it needs time.
But just to challenge that back, and maybe I'll offer to Vincent or Francine to come in. I mean, I love that idea that you're focused on that freedom, but I wonder whether there's limits to just trying to effectively incentivize individuals to shift, or whether there does have to be some sort of hard regulatory edges to this. So particularly if you take a tight city environment such as a Lisbon, or indeed any of the cities that are being represented today, you know, there's a level at which you can create a platform and show people what their options are and hope they will shift. But if that's not enough, you can imagine there's a level at which you financially incentivize people. So you develop the ideas of the congestion charges that exist in a number of cities. And you say, well, if you're going to come in any form of non-shared transport, then actually you're going to pay for that, whether that's your own car or whether you're jumping in a sort of Uber. And maybe there's another level as well, where you just don't let private or one-person vehicles into the city or into parts of the city, or perhaps you between 8 and 10 in the morning and in the rush hour in the evening, you just can't do that. And I know that seems terribly anti-libertarian, but I suspect that might be the only way of allowing the centre of some of our most congested cities to be able to continue to operate. Francine or Vincent, do you want to come in on that?
I would
Yeah,
like
I'm happy to come in. Sorry.
Yeah, Francine, go ahead. Oh, okay, because Richard, what you mentioned
Vincent, can you be a little bit louder?
Yeah, sure.
Come closer to your laptop, yeah.
Yeah, I muted myself because my son is quite noisy in the background. Richard, what you said in the end, that's very unpopular, to limit people and to limit their freedom and their possibilities. But I think you need to start doing that, because just by creating great offers and by creating some new services, that's at least the experience from Austria, people are just slightly incentivized to really change their mobility behavior. For example, in Wiener, and I know it as well from other provinces, people are not willing to share their private car. They're maybe willing to share a commercially equipped car from a provider, but they say, of course, as well, when it comes to ride pooling, I don't take anybody with me. It's my car, it's my private space. That's where I feel myself. And here I think we need to work with both sides, push and pull measures, and that means as well to limit people and to limit the freedom of people just for their greater good.
Thank you. Francine, you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. It was just on the role of the UK government in terms of shared mobility, what we're doing. So we're using our research program to understand the impacts of shared mobility models at the moment. So in particular, we're conducting research on the attitudes of those who currently share, and also what new service offerings will look like. So that's what we're doing there. We're still getting to grips with shared mobility, but like I said, we can definitely see that's on the rise.
But if I could come back to you on that, Richard, I absolutely do agree it needs to be both a carrot and a whip. And you need the combination. But until you have the real options that somebody can point to, well, if you can't use your car, you can actually use this instead.
Yeah.
You need that in order to be able to put in place stronger measures to push people.
Yeah, indeed.
I really agree as well.
Marta, back to you.
Thank you. Next question is from David, who is from the Belgian Ministry of Mobility and Transport. He's asking Vincent a question. Vincent, he says the Wiener MaaS model is famous for the strong involvement of the public sector. How does that work in practice, and what do you see as the pros and cons of this model?
Yeah, thank you. Good that we're famous for something. We started quite early to establish our own digital platform by really creating a company providing us with the technology for that, and it works in that case that we created a kind of open platform, which is which theoretically via APIs all kind of mobility services can connect to, with still the strong focus on public transport, because as I mentioned, public transport is just a backbone in transport in Vienna. The pro is for sure that we, of course, we manage data, we manage who to hand over our tickets for public transport, we manage who to share data with, but the cons there are as well quite obvious. I think, or I kind of doubt whether it's from the financial point of view as efficient as if we just would have asked the private company to provide us with such a platform. And another con as well is that we, of course, we in some way we need to follow the public assignment that we, of course, we are not allowed to discriminate anything We are, even as a public sector or a public company, we are towards the customer, we are not so attractive in terms of handing over data to us, which is very interesting. You know, always the example that to Google, you give voluntarily all your data and they track you permanently. But to Wiener Linien, which is basically the city of Vienna, people and consumers are not so willing and maybe not so open. Of course, but we communicate quite frankly that we are this is a public service, a public digital service, which customers not always appreciate, honestly.
Okay. There are a couple of questions on what will happen post-COVID-19. Professor David Henscher from the University of Sydney is asking that if we were to start seeing a continuation of greater use of car as a biosecurity outcome, then how will the cities and the governments respond to this? And specifically, he's asking if car sharing under MaaS can be achieved in sort of these circumstances. Yeah, anybody would like to sort of respond to this? Andre?
I think I'm just going to come in and say I think it's an absolutely spot on question. It's been worrying me since all of this started that if mass transit is seen as unsafe, then necessarily the volumes on those transit systems are going to remain damped long after the immediate threat and long after the lockdowns that we have in many countries start to be lifted. And we're seeing this data already from China. Now it's mitigated at the moment in China by the fact that total travel volumes are still depressed. So the levels of congestion have still not risen above 80% of what they were before the lockdown. But inevitably, what we're seeing is that public transport revenues are going to be reduced in the long term. And we're certainly, as an organisation, in discussion with many transport authorities, both public and private operators all over the world, who are desperately trying to put together scenarios for what it means for their financial viability over the course of the next year as well, because of course many of these services are run sort of very tightly in terms of trying to cost recover, and I think the next year could be very, very difficult. So it's both a public policy problem that you could see greater congestion with people move to cars, but it's also potentially a financial disaster for many authorities that rely on those transport revenues.
If I could comment on this, again, question is an excellent one. And being not just a compromise if you travel with public transit, now it's even a health risk. So it's sort of, even if we have been on good trajectories many places, this is definitely setting some stuff back. I think it's really difficult to say today, how is this going to be in 3 months or in 6 months? Because I think there's a lot going on, there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of movement. There's going to be a lot of new learnings about the situation, about the virus, what is contagious, what are the strongest paths it takes, what are the ones that aren't as strong. In Norway, we currently don't have any use of masks, face masks at all in public or anything like that. A lot of other countries have that. What are all these effects? I think there's going to be a lot of stuff going on, especially from public transit, to see if we can get volume back up. Because otherwise, as Richard pointed out, the economics of it is going to be disastrous. And also the societal effects. We're already seeing more cars on the road, and it's already creating congestion. So that's not viable either. And we're also seeing around schools and kindergartens, more people driving their kids to school and kindergarten, actually creating traffic risk around the kids close to schools and kindergartens. So this is starting to create fallouts in many ways that we need to deal with. As far as car sharing goes, there is an interesting thought. If you were able to do car sharing with I heard somebody call it a sort of a COVID group, where you would be sharing with basically some of the same people or a limited group over time, that might be a way to do car sharing. Is that better than having your car to yourself? Most likely not. Are there ways to try to work on incentivizing that? Well, if we can't get people on public transit and we're getting congestion, it becomes a societal issue. And then you're going to have to go back to, okay, what would be incentives or ways, or otherwise, how can we create those kinds of solutions? And I think that at least what we've seen over the last 2 months or so globally is a tremendous amount of innovation, both on policy and on solutions and on dealing with stuff. And I think a lot more of that is going to keep going on. So saying now how the situation is going to be in 6 months, anybody's guess. If I guessed anything, I'd most likely be wrong.
Okay, Vincent, you had a comment there?
Yeah, it's actually I can agree to a lot of things. I just wanted to place a little bit of data. We had recently an instance survey. Of course, we deal as well with stronger numbers in car transport in Vienna. We not only crashed the business for public transport, but as well for sharing services in Vienna. So free-floating car sharing dropped, their usage number dropped as well immensely in Vienna. Station-based car sharing as well. Scooters were completely removed from public space. But in this instance survey, people tend as well, of course, they're quite, they're not very happy about using public transport, but they more tend, alternatively, at least in this survey, which comprised, I think, a couple of hundred people, they're more willing to use active modes of transport, means cycling and just walking. A lot of people say, okay, then I just do some more walking as an alternative.
Okay, we've already overshot time, and I do see there are a lot of follow-up questions there. So I will share these questions with all our panelists, and perhaps they can send their responses back to the attendees. There's also a comment for Richard there, so I will share that with you as well, Richard. Once again, thank you very much for joining today. And thank you very much, Endre, Francine, Richard, and Vincent. A big thank you to also our attendees for making it an interactive session. I look forward to receiving your feedback. So I will let you know about the next webinar next week. Before we leave, I also want to give a note of thank you to our sponsors who have made this possible for us: Eden Spikeman, Innovactory, Aoki, Move It, Thalis, and Wizway. Thank you. Thank you all. Have a wonderful weekend and see you in 2 weeks' time. We will keep this on for 10 minutes in case there are more questions coming in, and we will share those with our speakers, or if anybody would like to leave any feedback or suggestions for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much once again to all our attendees. If you have any feedback, any suggestions for us, please feel free to put that in the Q&A or the chat tab, or send it to me. You all have my email address. So I look forward to getting some feedback and suggestions from all of you on what the next 8, on what we could do in the next 8 webinar series. We are also trying to identify a way as to how we can all network using one of these virtual platforms. So perhaps in one of those, one of the sessions, we can have a networking break of sorts in between, and we will reach out to you with more details.